I take it, the PowerPoint is showing. Yes, I can see it showing. Well, first of all, I want to thank Mohammed Maraktan for the invitation to speak at this fascinating symposium. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. I also want to thank Sheikh Hassan for his support of Asirat and of this symposium. I met Sheikh Hassan back in 1989 when I was in Doha at Markaz Turath Shabi wal Khalij al Arabiya studying agricultural almanacs. So it is great to see him again. And also, I want to thank Andre. Much of what I'm talking about will be similar to what Andre is talking about. Time telling is timeless. While it is not possible to know exactly how our earliest hominid ancestors reckoned time in ways that we today call hours, days, weeks, months, seasons, and years, and how they knew directions, there were several natural features available, as the Quran states, and you can see that in front of you. The impact of the observable heavens was made plain to me in 1992 when I was about to sleep on a rooftop of a house in Yemen's remote Jebel Burra. The entire sky, not cluttered with artificial lights, was dotted with stars. It was as if there was no darkness. Along with the daily observation of the trajectories of sun and moon, the natural triumvirate of sun, moon, and stars would surely have been a guide long before what we in hindsight call civilization and a formal science of astronomy. The purpose of my paper, I'm interested in looking at what are the possible ways in which time telling by stars and seasons for changes in the weather, particularly rain and heat, agriculture, pastoralism, travel, have been reckoned in South Arabia based on what is documented for Yemeni folk astronomy during the Islamic era, much of which has gone through to the present. The rationale for my paper. Well, there appear to be a lack of confirmed Sabaic, Katabanian, Minoan, etc., and I'd be happy to know if there are terms for stars, really distinct terms that we can do for stars. Yes, we have, of course, moon, we have Athar, Kida. There are plenty of stars identified for Mesopotamia, the Levant, Egypt, Greco-Roman area, India, even into Ethiopia at the same time. And the other thing that's interesting about Yemen is that the Himyarite month names, they've been described already, were adopted in Yemeni Arabic dialects for seasons. Now, I'm going to give you just a brief summary of the paper, which is obviously much longer, and I'll be glad to share it with anyone who would be interested. I have a brief discussion of time reckoning in relation to the weather. And then I look at what are the unique Yemeni dialect terms for stars and asterisms in the Rasulid sources, and then those after the Rasulid era. And then a few words about the Pleiades conjunction calendar, that's the Qiran that you already heard about from Andre, and then the Himyarite month calendar as it is represented in Yemeni Arabic during the Islamic era. So what are our sources? Well, one, we don't have very early sources. I mean, if you think about it, one of the earliest is al-Hamdani, but look, he's already writing 3 centuries or so after the beginning of Islam. He mentions a few names of seasons and stars that are unique to Yemeni dialect. My main source is from the Rasulid era, and in particular, an astronomical treatise, Kitab al-Tabsira fi al-Nujum of Malik al-Ashraf Umar. He was the 3rd Rasulid Sultan and died right at the end of the 13th century. Now, in 1994, I published an edition in Arabic, a translation and an annotation of the agricultural almanac within the Kitab al-Tabsira. What is really important about the Rasulid sources, now we're talking 13th to 15th century in Yemen. There are 2 major agricultural texts. I'm currently working on a major volume on Rasulid agriculture. I have just finished my translation into English of the Milh al-Malaha of Malik al-Ashraf, and parts of the Buhyat al-Falahin of his grandnephew. There are several major almanacs, and I've published several of those already. Right now, I'm working on a unique zodiacal almanac of Malik al-Abbas. He was the grandnephew of al-Ashraf. It's called Kitab Salwat al-Mahmum fi Ilm al-Najum. What is unique about it is that instead of being by the Julian reckoning, which is what most of the Yemeni almanacs are, it's by the degree of the zodiacal constellation. Now, since then, you have had many, many almanacs, most still in manuscript. In the middle of the last century, you had the work of Muhammad al-Haidara. Sargent published a almanac that Haidara had published in 1954. This one's from 1974. There's the work of Yahya al-Ansi. He's a Yemeni who has traveled all over Yemen. He has collected an amazing amount of local information, and he has emphasis on folk astronomy. I would simply say that he is not trained as an astronomer, so one needs to critically assess what he writes. And then, of course, you just heard from Andre. There aren't too many of us who have looked at stars. Andre is one of them. I looked at time-telling in stars in El Ahjor, where I lived in 1978-79, which is to the northwest of Sana'a, and there have been just a few others. Now, in the Rasulid sources. So this is from the Tabsira of Malik al-Ashraf. And here, as you will see, underlined in blue is a ṣirab al-Yamaniya, talking about the rising of, and that's the classical term for Sirius, the brightest star in the sky. And then it goes on to say that the farmers in the mountains call it Elub or Alib, it has different ways of being pronounced, and in the Tahaim, or in the coastal region, they call it Badges. These are two names that do not exist outside of Yemen, and both of those names survive to the present. They were in use in the 13th century. We're not sure how earlier they were. Now, there's another Rasulid almanac of Abu al-Awwal, and he here is talking about the month of Haziran, or June, and he mentions the tulu', the rising of Sulm, wa huwa mankab al-Jawza. Well, mankab al-Jawza is the classical term for Alpha Orionis. Abu al-Awwal wrote a Zij. He was an astronomer. So here we have another local name that again survives to the present. And one other, I'm just giving you a few examples. This is hard to read because of the red didn't come out too well. But above that red line, it says Nujum as-Sawab, and it's 4 stars in a square. And these, as you can see, are said to be in the path of Suhail, which is Canopus, and it's opposite to Binat Nash, which is Ursa Major. Very important star in Yemen, very important constellation in Yemen. And then if you look, and so although he doesn't identify it exactly, it fits the definition of Pegasus. And then you have, with the green underlining, a Sabaic al-Awwal and a Dhafar al-Awwal. I know it's missing the nukta, which is quite common, but it is Dhafar. And these are defined in the Rasulid sources as Alpha and Beta Centauri. Now, after the Rasulid era, you have use of a number of these star names. Now, this is a particular chart called the 28 Ma'alim az-Zira', the agricultural markers, if you will. And you will see as I point, the red goes to Ilb, and the green goes to Tulu al-Sulm. And there's also a variation called Dhom, which is either the same star or maybe not the same star. It's an interesting observation. But you will also note here, and this is referring to 28 of them, these are equated with these Anwa that were referred to, the 28 system of Anwa, the classical formal model of astronomy. And alub is equated with nathra, and silm with zira, and this is, it would be actually a whole circular chart. Now, I want to say a few words about the anwa. Originally, this referred to a way of dividing up the entire year, 365 days, by 28 asterisms, which would be a period of 13 days each. 13 days is a rather odd period of time, shall we say. And it originally referred, although there is disagreement, to the dawn setting of, and they're zodiacal stars, right? Because the moon's orbit and the sun's, this is the sun's orbit. I argue this is not indigenous at all to Arabia. The system of 28 anwa. Several of these stars, of course, are. They were well known. They're all over the region. It was clearly borrowed from the lunar zodiac of India, the nakshatras. And what happened is that, and this would have happened after contact, probably through Sasanian Iran, and then with the lunar zodiac of India, simply plotting this over the solar year. So what do we mean by manazil al-qamar, which has already been referred to? In English, this is usually called the lunar stations, in German Mondstationen. It's also called the lunar mansions. I prefer lunar stations. Just a note here, the reference to the manazil in the Quran, I believe, are not at all to this, even though many of the tafsirs say that. Ibn Kathir makes the argument, which makes much more sense, that it's referring to the phases of the moon, because that's what was actually used for telling time. And there's a reference that it goes until the moon dries up like an old palm branch. Well, that fits the phases very well. But I'm here talking about a system, and you've already seen this chart earlier. There is a distinction between the sidereal month, the time it takes for the moon to return to the same spot in the sky, 27 1/3 days, and the phases. The lunar calendar that we know, the Hijri calendar, is a little bit more than 2 days longer. Okay, so if you have 360 degrees for this orbit, then each 24-hour period, the moon is within 13 degrees of arc, and you pick the stars that you want there because the lunar orbit is so close to the ecliptic, they're zodiacal. Now, there's something called the Pleiades conjunction calendar, and it's found not only in Yemen. This is from someone in Saudi Arabia. It's known in the Gulf. It's actually known in Afghanistan, in Palestine. And if you look at this image, you will see that it's the halal of the moon. It says in Arabic, halal shawwal, in 1445. This is when the picture was taken, and that is equal to April 11th in 2024. And it's hard to tell, but those are, the Pleiades are a number of very faint stars. You can see that it's close to the Pleiades. And there's a statement up there about when it's related to this being on I think it's, I can't see it because my picture's in the way, either the 3rd or the 5th day. But that's same, and that's recent. Ibn Qutayba, now we're going back to the 10th century, has this statement that when إذا قارن القمر بالثريا الخمسة فقد ذهب الشتاء. When the moon conjuncts with the Pleiades on the 5th day, it's the 5th day of the lunar month, the 5th day after the halal, that is a time when winter has gone. So what is the justification for this? This is all from Ibn Qutayba. Ibn Qutayba says the new moon conjuncts with the Pleiades. It's aligned with the Pleiades. It doesn't really cover it generally. Once a year, and it's always in Nisan, in April, just before the Pleiades disappear from view, because they're behind the rays of the sun. And if you think of that, then 2 days earlier, right, there will be a conjunction on the 3rd day, right? 5 days earlier, there will be a conjunction on the 5th day, right? It goes back 2 days earlier each one. So a conjunction 5 days earlier would be in the month of Shabbat, if we're going from Nisan 3 would be in March, and then you go back to February. Generally, this is, as Andre pointed out, this is not for the entire year. It generally goes back to conjunction number 17 or conjunction number 19. And Ibn Qutayba says that you observe the moon when it is aligned with the Pleiades at midheaven. Now, just a couple of comments on the Himyarite month calendar, and I'm only talking about how it is represented in Yemeni Arabic sources. This is again from the Kitab al-Tabsara of Malik al-Ashraf. And this is for the month of Tishrīn al-Awwal, which is the first of the Julian reckoning of the Syrianiya, or they're called in Yemen the Rumi months. But you will note where the red arrow is going. It's called ṣurāb. And ṣurāb is used throughout Yemen for the harvest season, often in this time, but not necessarily. And saraba becomes a verb you can use for harvesting. Right? You'll only find this in Yemen. This is not a term used outside of Yemen. Now, we find the list of these 12-month names, because he does it for every one of his months here, also in a very interesting text by Ibn Rahik, which is a century earlier. And there's a poem of al-Bahr al-Na'ami from the 12th century. And there's even another example in an almanac attributed to Ja'far as-Sadiq. Okay. Now, the point is that we don't know how long this system had been actually used, because this is from a scholar. How many people, how many farmers would need or would even want to have a system that defined the whole year? And a number of these terms are actually used for seasons. So here we see an example for Tammuz, which of course is July, and it's Dhu Madra, okay, which is of course the Himyarite name. Now it's interesting that Madra, as you can see here, I give an example from the Yemeni dialect book of Mutahir al-Iryani, the Mawsam al-Ari, of Badr, the season in which you plant. And here you can see in the almanac of al-Ashraf for the 23rd day of July, he's saying, Dhari al-Bur al-Nasul wal-Wasni. Okay, Bur is the Yemeni term for wheat, Nasul is ember wheat, Wasni is the best variety of wheat at the time. And there are other examples, but I'm just giving you an idea. So my concluding remarks. With no everyday need for a solar calendar, or no ritual need for a formal lunar calendar, if I'm a farmer and I'm farming, I don't need to know every day of the year. I need to know those important periods of time. And if I don't need a ritual need, like the lunar calendar for knowing the Ramadan, etc., stellar observations would have been a natural marker. Not just stellar, I should point out. They're also, where I lived in El-Ahjor, they use Ghom Shams. They use where the shadow of the sun, because of the way the sun changes course, could also be a marker of the season. Now, we know that the observation of major stars and constellations was widespread in the Middle East and in most known societies. And the local Yemeni dialect terms for stars and seasons may very well have been adapted from Sabaic or other earlier languages. So I've given you some examples of what might be coming from an earlier South Arabian language. For Sirius, we had Alib and Bajis. The Pleiades, Kama and Kima, as has already been pointed out, with the Hebrew cognate and the Ethiopic cognate. But in the area that I live, it was called Sabr. And so this is not a term you'll find in any dictionary. Sawab, Pegasus. Sabaic and Zafar, Alpha and Beta Centauri. Sulm is Alpha Orionis. And then there are other terms. Far, which has an interesting use in South Arabic, is used for Simak. And then there are terms Salmani, Sarb. Are they star names? These are part of the Ma'al Mazara'a, or are they seasonal names? Because in the Ma'al Mazara'a, you have both. And then quickly about the Pleiades conjunction calendar. This is found in Yemen. It's found in Saudi Arabia, the Gulf. As I noted, it's recorded for Palestine and Afghanistan. It's found all over the place, okay? To my knowledge, it has not yet been analyzed by a trained astronomer. I am curious, I have some ideas, but I'm curious that it's interesting that there would always be a conjunction between a particular star and the new moon in the same. It obviously would be within this. It's going to happen every month, but it would. This idea that it happens in Nisan with the Pleiades is quite fascinating, and I think needs more work. Now, how ancient is this? Well, we have the reference by Ibn Qutayba that that this system was being used, and so that's going back quite a few centuries. But there's really no way to know if it was used before the Islamic era, unless I haven't seen it in the poetry. If there is an example in the poetry, that would be fascinating. And finally, the Himyarite month names. They were, it's hard to find, apart from these written sources, and a very few written sources, that they would have kept all the names. But these are common throughout Yemen. Ṣirab for the autumn harvest. Alan for the autumn rains, absolutely. And a planting season is Madara or Madari. And there are other examples. Qais is also used for the summer period. If you ever get to the New York Metropolitan Museum, you can see the astrolabe made for Malik al-Ashraf, who describes it in his Kitab al-Tabsira. It's been studied in great detail by my good friend David King. Shukran jazilan.
Thank you, Professor Faresco.